So at the outset of this study on numerics, I think I would like to say, at least personally, that I wouldn't be one to want to establish doctrine and dogma necessarily from such a subject. And I'm keenly aware that there will be those here who are maybe not necessarily so excited about such a subject. And yet I find by observation some interesting things I think that we can sort of conclude as we look at the way in which God has used numbers in bringing to us His Word. Again, sometimes I say, what kind of a God do you serve? Is your God just sort of an arbitrary God who just kind of throws things out there? Or is there a sense of a bit of order behind what God does in the way in which He communicates to us and in the way in which He gives us His Word, the way in which He pieces the Word together, and the way in which that it unfolds to us in terms of, again, for our subject this evening, numerics. So in beginning, where do we begin? But at the beginning. Number one. So biblically, as we give consideration to number one, what is the significance of number one? Ponder that one a while. I mean, what is so interesting about the number one? If this were a classroom setting, I think I would probably pause and allow for some response. But in this case, I think I will simply proceed to give us input relative to the numbers. First of all, number one is a number that stands alone, stands by itself. Number one is the number that cannot be divided. There's no other, no comparison, no division. Stands for unity of sorts. It's understood as the primary number, the beginning of numbers in many ways. As a cardinal number, it denotes unity. And as an ordinal number, it denotes primacy. In other words, again, it's the whole idea of standing alone. It's the idea of no comparison, and other things as well. It's also a great cause that is independent of others. In other words, for example, for we in the Christian faith, we believe that we are serving one God, and that one God is an uncaused cause standing by Himself, not compared with any other. So once more, at the outset, giving consideration to number one, a number that stands by itself and alone. It also excludes all differences. There is no second with which to compare number one. There's no second with which to, or any other with which to harmonize or with which to conflict. Again, one is by itself all alone. So, in God, there is a sufficiency which needs no other. Again, God, our eternal God, standing by Himself, standing alone, again, sufficient in and of Himself, needing no other. Number one also marks beginnings. As, for example, in the text, Genesis, in the beginning was the Word, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning was the Word, is over in the Gospel of John. Again, that which marks beginning. Interesting also, I think, to observe in Scripture firsts and lasts of sorts. For example, if we take a look at the words of Jesus, I find it interesting, isn't it the case, that I believe the first words of Jesus that are recorded in our text, what are they? Wist ye not that I must be about my Father's business? Fascinating. Maybe I'll pause right here at this juncture and just say, I recall several years ago in which I was at a retreat, and an elderly lady in her 90s, I think, said that she did an exercise in reading through the Bible or reading through certain texts and focusing on all the verbs that she would find along the way. Interesting exercise. Try it sometime. Just read through the text and observe all the verbs. What happened? Verbs are movement. In this case, we are taking a look at numbers. So as we go through, we're going to focus on numbers and what they do and how they may speak to us. So again, I was suggesting that we do something about the first. Again, in Jesus' ministry, in Jesus' first words, he said, "Wish ye not, I must be about my Father's business." In his ministry, some of the first words were, "It is written, it is written, it is written." Again, the first in terms of Jesus' ministry. And then also, I think we're aware, when it comes to Jesus' ministry, or his sayings, actually, the final one that he uttered, "It is finished." Interesting. Now, as we begin to pull these together, "Wish ye not, I must be about my Father's business," the first, and the last, "It is finished." At least I find it interesting. It's also intriguing that in the first book of the Bible, we find divine supremacy and sovereignty when it comes to calling and when it comes to election. It's interesting that God in his sovereignty called Abram and no other. He called Isaac and not Ishmael. Jacob and not Esau. Ephraim and not Manasseh. Find it also interesting that from Matthew chapter 22, verse 37 and 38, perhaps I turn to that one very quickly. Again, Matthew chapter 22, verse 37 and 38. And Jesus said unto him, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. This is the first and greatest commandment." And he concedes and says, "And the second is like unto it, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." And he proceeds as well, "On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." Once more, interesting that we're talking now about the commandments, and the first commandment, which is the greatest commandment, loving God. In essence, with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. I'd like to make here perhaps a little sidebar of sorts, and that is that I find it interesting that in the Hebrew language, we have two words which are translated as one. I mean, as when you read your text, you're going to find one. And the first word that is referred to as one, translated as one, is echad. I will try to, and this looks like this is not doing too well, but try to get it up here in the Hebrew. Let's see, for in echad, which means, it is translated one. The other one is let's see. One that is for one is yichad, which is in the Hebrew so echad and yihad. The second word here, yichad, means absolute unity or or uniqueness or the only one. For example, when God was speaking, I think with Abram, he said, take your son, your only son, your yichad. But the word that is used, for example, in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 5, and what is it? Genesis 1 and verse 5, we're talking back there in creation. And he says, And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and the evening and the morning were the first day. The evening and the morning were the Echad. Echad brings with it the concept of compound unity. And I find that intriguing. I find that interesting because there are other places where it is used as well. Again, the evening and the morning were the first day, or Yam Echad in the Hebrew. And of course we have like Yom Kippur, you're familiar with that. And so basically what it is saying is that the evening and the morning were a compound unity of a day. In other words, the day has, can we say, multiple properties to it. And so when we understand that, then we go on further. And another one that is used in Genesis in chapter 2 and verse 21, and he took one of his ribs. He took echad of his ribs, a compound unity from his ribs, and made woman. Find that intriguing. And then we continue on further, picking up in Genesis in chapter 2, verse 24, where he states, therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they two shall be one flesh, echad. I find that interesting. Again, I say this very kindly. Occasionally, maybe a pastor might say, well, that's just God's math. You know, he takes two and he makes one. Yes, okay. And yet, on the other hand, if we look at it from the standpoint of echad, or the compound unity, he takes two, brings them together, and makes a compound unity from that union. Let's see, I think there was a marriage here even just yesterday. There's a sense, I think, in which our relationship to Jesus is echad, a compound unity. Part of him, part of us. Yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. There's a principle that comes through there. And incidentally, I did a study earlier about Hebrew versus Greek thought, and it is such that these concepts that are coming through are indeed Hebraic in nature. And so therefore, for example, again, the word echad, relationally, has the idea of face-to-face with a shared vision. Again, echad, face-to-face with a shared vision. So therefore, as we might think again from chapter 2, verse 24 in Genesis, the two shall become one flesh, face-to-face with a shared vision. Again, the essence of echad. And I think it's to understand that, again, yes, that echad leaves with us sort of that understanding of the shared vision in terms of relationship. I'd like to then to proceed to the number 2. So if number 1 is significant in no comparison, no division, what else did we say? Unique, as well as nothing can be harmonized with it or conflict,